All right. Well, we can jump right ahead to the third slide here. Just wanted to also call out, I'm presenting this paper today on behalf of Jan, the main author on this paper. He unfortunately was unable to attend. So certainly feel free to answer any questions at the end, but also feel free to contact him as well. Just so some brief background here for what we were looking at in this paper, we were fairly interested in some breaking news in 2017, 2018, when there was a very significant flaw discovered in the WPA protocol, which impacted both Wi-Fi networks secured with WPA and WPA2, which was this so-called KRACK attack, K-R-A-C-K. And at the time that this vulnerability was discovered, it actually would be impacting somewhere in the range of 13 billion Wi-Fi devices worldwide. This was something that was incredibly impactful. If you go to the next slide, there's just some brief background, but I'll also now skip over this. It's a bit technical anyways. But essentially, this KRACK attack was something that exists that allowed for a whole host of nefarious kind of attacks on Wi-Fi networks, including man in the middle and kind of spoofing of different things here. So in kind of a KRACK vulnerability world, our main goals of this study were kind of twofold. We first and foremost wanted to actually, at the time of this vulnerability, and actually even upwards of a year or 2 years after this vulnerability was discovered, we were very interested in understanding the current device KRACK vulnerability landscape at a global scale. One of the ways that we attempted to get around this was to use public logs analysis through publicly available data of devices and mobile operating systems. But in addition to that, we were also interested in kind of the human element of this as well. So thinking about how members of the quote unquote average population might be aware of, first and foremost, something as specific as the KRACK attack, and whether or not they're aware of any other information security vulnerabilities in general. And as a part of that as well, very interested in assessing these participants' awareness of Wi-Fi vulnerabilities, discussed with them some of their general security practices, knowledge of security tools, and to what extent they actually perceived these various risks to be a threat to them. You can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of methodology, this is really kind of a two-part study. First and foremost, like I said, the kind of logs analysis. But for the qualitative portion of the paper, we issued a pre-survey / questionnaire to participants, both to collect kind of demographics, but also to capture a lot of background information on participants' Wi-Fi usage and network management. So actually getting them to do things like give us a topology of their network and things like this, as well as then following up with a semi-structured interview covering a number of the topics that I previously mentioned and a bit more. We talked to 16 participants, all in Munich, Germany at the time, definitely heavily skewed towards male here, partially due to the snowball sampling that was utilized by Jan to get these different participants here. Though we did actually have a decent mix of occupations and professions, 9 of these participants being students. Age range also a bit more wide, from ages 20 to 61. We also noted that as part of the study, almost all of our participants had a laptop or other computing device, as well as a smartphone, though we did have one participant who did not have a smartphone. So at a high level starting off, I wanted to go over the kind of market analysis that we did of KRACK susceptible devices, and we can go to the next slide here. So looking at vulnerable devices here, we have on mobile platforms. On the left table here, we have Android, and on the right, we have iOS. And essentially what we're looking at is, and this is actually current, so this is even as of June 2020, as we continue to update these figures, we see that on Android, we still estimate that there are 7.6% of the Android population devices that are still vulnerable. Worth noting that the threshold for what we consider to be vulnerable is Android devices on Android 5.0 or earlier. As we all may or may not know, the Android system can be fairly fragmented in terms of updates. So this number is not necessarily surprising, but it does still seem fairly high. And then we also took into account iOS as well, where we're looking at approximately 5.3% of a minimum of still vulnerable devices. And this is just to keep this in mind. This is still somewhere in the range of 40 million devices. And in this case, for iOS, these are devices that would be on iOS 11 or below, which actually is only about 2 years behind the current iOS release, which is 13, with 14 coming in the fall. So some interesting data points there. In terms of desktop and or laptop devices, we see a little bit more coverage. For Windows machines, we're seeing as little as 1.5%, still remaining to be vulnerable. This is approximately 20 million devices. Again, for Windows, this is basically folks who have Windows 8, Windows Vista, or Windows XP as their platform who may not have received security updates here. And for Mac OS, we're looking at 4.8%, or an estimated 5 million vulnerable Mac OS devices currently there. For Mac, we're looking at an OS 10 Yosemite 10.10, so also not too far behind here in terms of OS 10. And what that leaves us with is this interesting conclusion, if we hit the next slide here, from a higher level, is that at a minimum, we're still looking at, in June 2020, over 200 million devices still being impacted by this specific Wi-Fi vulnerability, which is certainly an interesting state to find ourselves in. We say at a minimum here because there are, this is only from publicly available data, and it's unclear if we're capturing everything. We can go to the next slide. I also apologize if you start to hear some noise. It's 8:19 in the morning, and the lawn service people are here in my apartment complex, and they're standing right outside. So moving forward into the results of the kind of semi-structured interviews we did, starting off at a high level, we wanted to talk to different participants about kind of their knowledge of standard web security and potential security tools. This covered things like HTTPS, VPN awareness, and things like this. Of the participants we talked to, many of them were at least partly or entirely aware of HTTPS, though some noted that they didn't pay particular attention to this. As participant 3 noted, as we have on the right, it certainly depends on the context. If I do some unimportant activities, no, and that's no as in not caring so much about HTTPS versus standard HTTP. But if it's concerned with my user or banking data, yes, this is something that I keep in mind. As far as VPN awareness and usage, this was something we also wanted to talk to participants about. We found that many of our participants had never utilized a VPN prior to the study, though we did have one participant who used a VPN to actually route all of their network traffic through. This was a particularly tech-savvy user in this instance. A bit kind of a lighter version of a VPN in some ways. This concept of Tor. In Germany, Tor is kind of a much more popular, or at least a little bit more known of a tool than in some other countries. So we also asked them about Tor. And while we found most participants had never really utilized Tor, again, one participant noted that they used it regularly. Our main takeaway from this, is at least up front, was that in general, higher level encryption was often not ensured by participants in this study. We can go to the next slide. Then we wanted to ask an interesting question of participants. I think this kind of ties in interestingly to the last conversation about self-reported kinds of technology use. And we actually wanted to ask our participants, is your Wi-Fi safe? To what extent do you think your Wi-Fi is safe? And for better or for worse here, I actually think we got a fairly honest response from these participants, where at least half of them believed their Wi-Fi networks to be insecure, while some did think their networks were secure. And then we had a few that were kind of in the middle, where they're like, I'm not really sure so much. However, the participants who believed their networks to be insecure generally felt pretty comfortable with this, and kind of were very comfortable with this level of insecurity, and really blamed their own actions for this, mainly citing handling of password security. As participant 2 stated, no, my Wi-Fi network is not secure because my password is, and actually in this moment, Jan noted the participant actually blurted out the password, even though we had asked them many times not to do so. But they noted their password's really weak because they and everybody else in the house knew the password. And similarly, participant 8 had a really funny instance where they thought their network was very insecure because they literally had their password hanging on a kitchen cabinet. And during the interview, they actually noticed that, oh, actually, this kitchen cabinet lines up with a window. So actually, anyone standing outside on the street could pretty easily look in and see our Wi-Fi password. So kind of a funny instance of network insecurity there. We can move on to the next slide. Another thing that we talked about with participants as part of this kind of perceived feeling of security was whether or not individuals had actually changed factory settings on their Wi-Fi routers, whether this be their password, the network name themselves, whether or not this was publicly or privately broadcasting. And that while many had reported changing their router's factory settings, most cases a password, some also noted that they didn't change the password. Specifically, participant number 2 down here, stating that they believed their network was fairly insecure because they took their Fritzbox, which is a common router in Germany, and simply sent a picture of the kind of default SSID and the password there and sent it around via WhatsApp. And that's how they logged everything. And they even noted themselves that they did not think this matched the definition of security. Next slide. In terms of perceived risk while using Wi-Fi networks, as we started to get beyond kind of asking how secure they thought they were and getting into what actually the threat to them or potential threat to them was, most participants identified a number of ways in which they thought they could be vulnerable. A lot of this included things like the leakage of personal or sensitive data. This included pictures, medical information, and more. A fair number of concerned people about attackers gaining access to the network, mostly to conduct kind of illicit activities on the network kind of privately. But in general, most participants really identified their major concern or threat as bank information or search history as being their most valuable assets, and we're a little bit concerned about possible blackmail or extortion. However, and we can see this on the next slide. Next slide. One of the major things that we were seeing here was this total thought of perceived risk, and I think this is fairly common with the literature, was that most of this risk was mostly perceived for others. So despite people saying, you know, these are some concerns we would have about Wi-Fi security and more, that they were fairly confident that they would not be the target of cyber attacks, mostly due to them saying, you know, things like we're not important enough, our home environment is small and secure, our neighborhood is small, or they thought that they might not possess any information that they deemed to be sensitive. However, participants were quick to point out people like politicians and other people of prominence, but there was a general attitude of not me in terms of who could be vulnerable here. We can go to the next slide. Now getting into specific knowledge about KRACK itself, only a very few participants reported any knowledge of specific KRACK attack, and most of these participants who were aware found this out through kind of mainstream media publications or discussions in the news. And additionally to this, kind of beyond KRACK, only some participants reported any general concern about Wi-Fi vulnerabilities in general. These people just generally weren't that concerned about their security, again, because of not feeling like they would actually be susceptible to an attack. Next slide. So one of the other things we wanted to do is, in addition to kind of a wide level analysis of mobile device at scale, we also actually wanted to check with the participants that we talked to as to how vulnerable their own personal devices were to KRACK attack. And just wanted to note here, the device numbers here are higher than kind of the number of people we talked to in the study. This is also because in some instances participants shared with us either they had multiple devices or they were taking a tally of other devices in the household as well. So many of the participants that we talked to reported that they were either unsure or did not believe their devices were protected against KRACK. In reality, we did find that a number of participants were still vulnerable. For our Android participants, 6 of 16 still had vulnerable Android devices, and for iOS, only 3 of 8 were protected, while 5 of 8 participants at the time were still vulnerable to KRACK. If we're going just off of ratios here, and I don't really like to use numbers in terms of qualitative data, but in terms of broad ratios, these numbers were, both higher than what was calculated based on global device averages. And next slide. In terms of computer inspection, again, as we might expect here, the numbers were a bit more in line with the global average, but still a bit off. For Windows participants, we had 13 of 16 were protected, whereas 3 of 16 were vulnerable. However, for our macOS and Linux participants, we had full coverage. All of our participants were protected. We can go to the next slide. And lastly, one of the things we were interested in talking to participants about, at least that we'll cover in this presentation here, is kind of the desired communication about vulnerabilities when they occur from either providers or other sources to people in the real world. We did find that most participants were really hesitant to accept any type of a kind of forced update or any kind of forced action from a vendor or things like that to patch a vulnerability, mostly citing loss of fear of losing functionality or the introduction of new bugs. However, we did find that these participants generally said that they would prefer multiple means of communication, partially through mainstream media, news outlets, and things like that, but said they also wouldn't necessarily mind communication from platforms or kind of manufacturing companies as well. We can jump through to the next slides here, and we'll bounce through this fairly quickly because we're at 15 minutes here. So some kind of final wrap-ups here. One thing that we still definitely wanted to point out is that despite this being a vulnerability discovered in 2018, KRACK is still a factor today and could still be a factor. We still have, at a minimum, several 100 million devices potentially impacted by this vulnerability. And kind of mixing this with, partially due to the technical nature of security, a number of participants, most of our participants, not being aware of KRACK even existing at all, or in broadly more speaking, not being very aware of Wi-Fi vulnerabilities in general. Next slide. As we find in a number of other common security studies, we also found a general lack of data security from participants with a general attitude of, this can't really impact me, and as a result, I shouldn't really need to worry about my security that much. We can go to the next slide, and I think potentially even the next slide after that, since we just kind of covered possible mitigations. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. As far as some limitations of research that we always just like to touch on, as this was mostly a qualitative study and we took a qualitative approach, we don't necessarily think this allows for true generalization, but we think this serves as an interesting starting point for future discussion on Wi-Fi security here. And we can jump ahead to the last slide here for the conclusion. So as I said, even 2 years later, we see that KRACK and other security threats to Wi-Fi seem to persist for quite a bit. Interesting to note that support periods for smartphones, and particularly Android with OS fragmentation, may be too short, and kind of flexible hotfix updates are not as commonly available for some of those devices. As I noted, participants were generally unaware of ongoing technical threats, especially in regards to Wi-Fi. And in addition to that, it was kind of a double-edged sword because these participants were also less concerned about these threats, as they did not consider themselves to be a target. So considering information and knowledge propagation would be an interesting thing to consider in terms of how to educate the public better in the future about these concerns. So we'll stop there. I apologize for having to rush through and for the technical limitations.